Okay, hi everyone. My name is Caroline Demou, and today I'll be talking to you about the impact of implicit bias in early childhood education. I first want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me talk to you about this today, and also thank you to Dr. Bai for supporting me as I research throughout this semester. So first, I want to discuss what is implicit bias and where do we see it in our daily lives. So Harvard professor Mahzarin Banaji defined implicit bias as referring to judgments made without conscious awareness about a person based on groupable features such as age, gender, race, ethnicity, social status, sexuality, and more. So where do we see it in our daily lives? It's important to note biases can be triggered by emotions. So we can see these biases come out in politics, interactions in the grocery store, when we're stuck in traffic. But these biases can also make us vulnerable. Oops. Okay. I have not considered my own implicit biases until I learned about this concept in Dr. Bai's class last semester. Everyone has their own implicit biases due to their own unique lived experiences, so I'd like to do an interactive portion. If you feel comfortable, I'd like you to raise your hand when I list these examples of biases. So if you have ever felt cultural bias of being stereotyped based on your culture or having negative assumptions made about your interest or your dislike based on your culture, please raise your hand. Thank you. Social biases. If you have ever misinterpreted a social cue and felt feelings of shame or embarrassment, I know I definitely have. Thank you. Gender biases. If you have ever heard the sayings, you throw like a girl, boys don't cry, or you're just being emotional, please raise your hand. Economic biases. If you've ever had a distinction about your character made based on the clothing that you wear, your source of transportation, your source of income, please raise your hand. Thank you. These biases can cause us to feel uncomfortable and feel ashamed of our strength and sensitivity. And if us as adults are feeling these biases, we need to consider how the children in our educational settings are experiencing these biases as well. So I first want to talk about how implicit bias impacts assessment. So our biases can translate into assessment data. The Leaders Project of Columbia University published an article saying children from different linguistic or cultural backgrounds may not have had the exposure to the ideas or knowledge that a test assessor is expecting. This can in turn increase the rates of children that are being referred for special education services when they're not needed. This can create flaws in the testing system. Okay, so early childhood education focuses mainly on child-assessor interaction versus child and physical test interaction. So I have the blue block example. So I, as the assessor, have set out materials, a bunch of different color blocks in front of me, and I have a child with me, and I ask the child, do you know which block is blue? The child does not respond. So again, I ask, do you know which block is blue? Again, the child does not respond because at home, agreeing means to remain respectfully silent, while disagreeing means to speak up. I, as the assessor, mark that the child does not know which block is blue, and I move on. This impacts their assessment data, but it can be avoided. We can identify cultural informants or members or families of the community, or members of the community or family members that can discuss which behaviors are expected within a certain culture. We can also restructure questions to guide children to the answer, like saying, pick up the block that is blue, or please point to the block that is blue, instead of saying, do you know? The Leaders Project also said that this impacts what children think about their own abilities. They said, if an assessor is continually marking a child's development or skills lower than they actually are, the child may lower their own expectations of achievement. This can cause misconceptions to grow about certain people and cultures, and in turn, less opportunities are provided, and children fall into a stigma that was created by those with a lack of knowledge about culture. So this also translates into our observation of children. The way that we observe children can be flawed. The Schubert Center for Child Studies performed a research, and it said that implicit bias in observation relates to racial discrimination. It was found that for Black children and for specifically Black boys, they are more prejudiced to be unruly and aggressive. Not only does this impact their self-esteem, but it impacts the amount of support that they receive and the discipline that they receive. The Child Care Service Association published a video observation study in which they asked preschool teachers to watch a video of children playing. They were told to look at these children and identify potential bad behaviors before they began. The children in this video were of different races and genders. There was also an eye tracking device installed to see which children the teachers were spending the most time looking at. The children in this video were child actors, and there was no potential bad behavior whatsoever in the entire video. However, the results showed that more time teachers spent looking at boys and at black children over girls and white children for potential bad behavior. It was identified that 43% of the time teachers looked to black boys, 33% of the time teachers looked to white boys, 13% of the time teachers looked to black girls, and 11% of the time teachers or white girls, and 11% of the time teachers looked to black girls. This is a direct example of how our observation impacts, or how our implicit bias impacts observation. The Schubert Center for Child Studies said, as teacher and student reports of perceived conflict improve, student performance improves. Providing culturally responsive support to both teachers and students may help to moderate the stressful effects of prejudice and discrimination on educational achievement. When a teacher's bias impacts the way that we observe children, it also affects their relationships with children and the children's family. The National Association for the Education of Young Children produced an anti-bias educational framework. It has 4 core goals: identity, diversity, justice, and activism. It is evident that teachers who hold biases against students spend less quality time with them and therefore provide less developmental support for these children. The National Association of Education of Young Children also has 4 goals of how teachers should interact with children to create beneficial relationships and trusting connections. These 4 goals are: teachers will nurture each child's construction of knowledgeable, competent, individual, personal, and social identities. Teachers will promote each child's comfortable, empathetic interaction with people from diverse backgrounds. This next one is very important because, like I said, we all have implicit biases. Teachers will foster each child's capacity to critically identify bias and will nurture each child's empathy for the hurt that bias causes. And lastly, teachers will cultivate each child's ability and confidence to stand up for oneself and others in the face of bias. It is so important to recognize our own biases because children will model the behaviors that they see adults represent. When educators take the time to learn about children and their family, a safe and constructive learning environment is created that sets a foundation for how children should treat themselves and others. Now, I know this sounds like a whole lot of negative, but we can do our part. So, how can we recognize and minimize bias? The first step we can take is just having awareness that bias exists. We can have our own mental health consultations to understand the why behind our implicit bias. We can also take online bias tests and bias training before beginning work with children and families. We can understand that having a lack of knowledge creates biases. So the more knowledgeable we are about cultural and gender stereotypes, social and economic values and structures, the less likely we are to be biased against them. And lastly, just making all students feel seen in the classroom. This can be done using music, art, books, and activities that highlight different people, identities, and cultures. This picture I have from the slide is actually from this book. It is called You, Me, and Empathy. It's by Janine Sanders. Not only is the message in this book great, but it depicts children from different cultures and races and genders and abilities. And having these kind of materials in the classroom really make children feel seen and minimize the impact of our bias. So I appreciate you listening to me talk to you about this today, and I am open to taking any questions that you may have.
We have sufficient time for about 3-4 questions.
Yes.
First, what is the job of the presentation?
Thank you.
And my question is, I'm thinking about my own presentation kind of like, and do you think implicit bias kind of has like an effect on children kind of attending like early childhood settings or like?
Oh, for sure. I mean, just the biases that children experience, and also it could be the biases that their parents have experienced. They might not want to put their child into that setting, so it could definitely decrease the rates of children going into early childhood centers because of that, yeah. Questions? Okay. Thank you very much.